Today, we have a special episode to share with you. Last week, the Association of Municipal Managers in Pennsylvania met for their annual conference in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. APMM is the premier association for Pennsylvania managers. I have been attending the conference off and on for decades, and I have to say I experienced some of the most engaged and meaningful sessions that I can remember at this conference. My best attempt to explain it is that I felt a little like the moment when we realize at a certain age that we are now the tip of the spear, and it is our turn to get things done. You look around the room and realize we are it, and there is so much to be done. I experienced moments of reckoning for this profession that so many of you have chosen, not just as a career, but as a vocation. The weight is heavy, but when you see generations come together, the willingness of those coming up in the field to make honest inquiry, and of those who have been around to offer honest, even gritty observations, it's powerful. And the best part of this is that we want collegial gatherings where we can debate, dialogue, and have a respectful exchange of ideas. In short, we want these very real conversations. The audio quality is not the best, and I edited out the opening conversations about why our 3 guests left Pennsylvania. I wanted to get to the heart of the matter, so you will get a sense of the issues on the minds of managers today, and I think it's fair to say that there are many local managers who can relate to these concerns. I thought the session was exceptional. The facilitator is Dave Kratzer, manager at Lower Makefield in Bucks County, and the guests include Dave Kratzer, county administrator at Livingston County, New York, Eden Ratliff, deputy city manager, City of Charlottesville, Virginia, and Matt Canlon, manager of South Boston, Virginia. 2 important questions that I heard in this session is it possible to be neutral, as the ethics code requires, and political at the same time in the interest of advocating for the profession? And also, can we examine what the role of government is today and what it needs to look like for tomorrow? This episode is part of the APMM Series on PCC Local Time podcast. Check out the show notes for more information, and thank you for listening. We open up with Dave Kratzer talking about the challenge of small governments in Pennsylvania. And so, we're off to the races.
Now, I had a very fortunate circumstance in State College, which has a very active council of governments. That's an anomaly. That is far more the exception than the rule. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. When I went to Susquehanna Township, by contrast, and I'm not picking on anybody specifically, but if Brad Gottschall and Teresa Everly went to their boards tomorrow and said, hey, we want to regionalize our fire service, I don't think they would kick them out, but a mountain to climb. It would not be an easy proposition because there would have to be first that nexus made. First, you have to break down the parochial nature that we all live in Pennsylvania, and when there's 2,600 local government units, that parochial nature is all the more strong than it might be if we were more, I think, aggressive with how we structure our governments. But you have to break that down, and then you have to be able to describe the virtues of it. And rather than having a foundation that recognizes regional cooperation and the economy of scale, now you have to essentially start from scratch. And I think other states, New York included, have already done a lot of that and kind of come to peace with that. You see regional cooperation in more regions.
Today we want to initiate the conversation, and we're hoping that these conversations will continue after today. I think things can actually be done about this. A question that needs to be asked across the Commonwealth is, at its core, what is the role of local government? Almost all of us would probably agree it's not really just to pave roads, plow, and help take care of trash. As Dave said, the government of today, right? What do our constituents expect of us? These municipal codes that say what we can and can't do are oftentimes tying our hands. So I think there needs to be a larger conversation about what is the future of municipal government and how can the laws be modified to allow it. It will be a huge mountain to climb. I think it's very possible that some of us will, on the younger side of this room, might get to retirement age still asking that question and maybe haven't made progress. But at some point, it's going to tip where we will have to. Right, the second class township code limits real estate taxes at 14 mils for general purposes. At some point, if there's no reassessment, we will see townships reach the max and they will need more funds in order to deliver the services that they're delivering. That's going to force a difficult conversation in the Commonwealth about the borough code, I think, unless all of a sudden counties start reassessing, which seems unlikely in certain parts of the state. I think these conversations are important, and the association and PML should try to be at the front of it and push that ball because there's a long way to go.
I haven't figured out a good way of articulating this, but there's a kind of a union mentality There's so many different constituencies. Just by virtue of the fact that you've got a borough code and a first-class township code and a second-class town, and all these, many states around the country got rid of that kind of stuff years ago. But we've got these entrenched constituencies that you can't really touch. If you're a local elected body, you don't have employees as much as you have constituencies that you have to pay attention to. And they have the ability to hurt an elected official because they vote. Back to Roosevelt's comment, if we unionize, you realize we're now negotiating against ourselves. So think about how your elected officials deal with the police. And here's the ticking time bomb. The way they deal with the police is the way they're going to have to deal with the fire when we convert everything to paid, which is coming. This union mentality that permeates the organizations breaks everyone up into groups. It's hard to get all of your employees to work as a team and one unit because they're all separate entities. And that's baked in, that's structural. I worked for Mayor Carlisle, a staffer up in Harrisburg. He said, Pennsylvania does not have the ability to do things big. Now, I don't know exactly what he meant by that, but I think I know what I mean. There's so many roadblocks because of the constituencies that it's impossible to take radar. That's a perfect example. It's so hard to make meaningful change. The gist of it is, and I don't know how you change that, but I think it all goes back to the union. If I could wave a magic wand and get rid of all the local unions, it would transform Pennsylvania.
Make sure you do the speed limit on your way back.
Yeah.
So transitioning back to, we talked a lot about structure that's focused on the profession of municipal management. Are there key lessons and best practices that you've been exposed to in your current state that you believe would enhance the profession of municipal management in Pennsylvania? And if so, what are they? I don't know if there's anything, just to provide some context, statutory protections, employment agreements, duration, those kinds of things create a certain environment in Pennsylvania that may be creating challenges to stability and people feeling tied to the community.
I think one conversation that AP could talk about potentially driving at the state level is what we're doing about these employment agreements. For those that know, of course, they can only last 2 years before the current cycle of the board. And what that means is if you have a severance agreement in your employment agreement, the board just has to wait you out. And then all of a sudden, if they haven't voted on your contract, they can let you go and you get nothing. That's a huge risk for Pennsylvania managers. And the risk that managers in the rest of the country in some states are not taking on. They're signing agreements that last multiple years, that give them that protection, that isn't only bound to 2 years. I think that is a recent law change. I think it wasn't even always the 2 years, and we saw that as a major win. I think we need to keep going. I think Pennsylvania managers should be protected. As we all know, this is a difficult field. We live in politically turbulent times. You're one election cycle away from a governing body that might turn on you. And that's challenging. So I think as an association, as a profession, we should be figuring out how to protect each other. You talked about being a free agent, which is what I am now too. It's difficult, right? You have lives and family and children. Put out on the street one day with nothing. It's really difficult.
Yeah, I think the trade-off used to be, and perhaps is, but less and less so, that the manager was the highest compensated, that we traded some of our other quasi-property rights to our employment arrangements because we recognized, number one, we had a commitment to the profession that far exceeded any compensation structure or employment agreement for the most part. But number two, that there was at least an acknowledgement that you were going to get a little extra consideration because of the reality that your job is essentially at will. There needs to be more of an effort from some of our professional consortiums and Municipal League. There does need to be coalescence around the protection of us as an employment class in Pennsylvania. But if one of your police officers has a grievance, he or she has a mechanism with which that can be adjudicated. And there are certain property rights that can be preserved as a result of that due process. They are represented by the FOP, or the attorney that represents that bargaining unit. They're not alone to twist in the wind of whatever circumstance they're being asked to deal with. We just had a general session on ethics, and there were some really good hypotheticals that were introduced, and I think we as a cohort can generally agree on the responses to some of those hypotheticals. But I'll tell you, as somebody speaking from personal experience, when you're in them, it's a different ballgame. It's much more difficult to stick to the script and answer that way. And when you're essentially left to your own devices with respect to advocating for yourself and maintaining that line, it can be really intimidating. It can be one of those elements that can push a manager to look at other states or other areas of the country that maybe some of those protections are inherently in place, and they don't have to feel so isolated and in a position where they have to handle all their own personal advocacy.
So I guess if we were smart, 50 years ago we would have unionized. I don't know how we would have done that, but we would have unionized and maybe we would have the protections. I would agree with everything you guys said. The problem in Pennsylvania is, unlike all of the other employee groups, we don't really have anyone representing us. If we think it's PML, you're kidding yourself. That's not a knock on PML. But if you think about it, they represent the elected officials. They don't represent the managers. When the two align, then they'll certainly back us up. Just understand who they are really working for and who pays their bills. They're representing the elected officials, so we can't count on them. And APMM is not really structured that way. So we don't really have any representation in Harrisburg. But we're trying to get our 2-year contract expanded. Who's going to do that? Think about it. Who's really going to take that up? Well, no one's going to take that up. Unless there's some benevolent PML director who suddenly says, I see the light, we need to help our managers. But they're representing the municipalities.
We had a very long call in preparing for the session, so we flipped the question on its head at some point, which was, if we wanted to attract top talent into Pennsylvania, would we be able to, and if so, how? I'm not sure that we would be able to. I think it would be really difficult because of how hard it is to manage in Pennsylvania. When we go to things like ICNA or local government reimagines rising and talk to managers around the country and start comparing what their management is like to what it's like managing in Pennsylvania, it very quickly realized how different it is. I mean, it really is a challenge. There's a lot of opportunity here, but challenges.
If I had a magic wand, I'm just here to offend all of you one way or another. But if I had one of the things, what I think would be one of the best ways to help the management profession in Pennsylvania is consolidation. And why do I say that? One of the problems with Pennsylvania is there's a tier of jobs that are really super desirable that pay really well. And then you've got this middle, and you've got all these really small ones. Some of them have managers, some of them don't, a lot of them are dysfunctional, and I've been involved in some of those. If you were to consolidate, you actually end up having more and better manager positions. Maryland has 157 municipalities. Virginia's got 100-something municipalities. We've got 2,600 municipalities, which is insane. I think one of the ways that you could help the profession is have bigger jurisdictions that are more stable, that actually have more power. One of the downsides is because we're all these little municipalities, we don't have nearly as much clout as we would if we had bigger, more solid jurisdictions. So I think attracting Pennsylvania, oh, by the way, let me just mention 2 really good things, because it's all a negative thing, but with your local control. You can pretty much no one's telling you how to do your land use in Pennsylvania. So the county's not meddling, the adjoining jurisdictions aren't. You have a lot of local control in your community. Secondly, our benefits are very inexpensive. You go to some of these other states, you'd be paying hundreds of dollars a paycheck for individual plus one or individual family. Whereas in Pennsylvania, I think I was paying $30 a paycheck for a family plan, which is unheard of. So it's not all bad, but I think overall, you should go manage Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina. I think Pennsylvania would rank low because of all the things that we talked about.
Next question, please.
We talked about a lot there. Are there any additional recommendations that you have as being former members, but also individuals that have now been exposed to other associations representing the respective states? Is there anything on a statewide association perspective that you've learned from Virginia or New York that you think would be beneficial to the membership here at the
Sure. First and foremost, at least my experience, what it's been for these last few months, APMM is second to none with respect to the quality of networking and the collegiality that we have and our information sharing and just the kinds of ideas that we exchange at these conferences and offline. I think it really is the upper echelon of professional consortiums for our profession, but I would put it up against probably any others that exist. I don't have that same network yet, and I'm still building it, but what I have been able to observe and be exposed to with respect to trainings and the kinds of engagements that we have are not the same quality and ilk that I get here out of APMM, and I always have. One of the things that I would suggest that the association continue to lean into is having those difficult conversations. Part of my goal in my tenure as president was to emphasize the importance of the next generation and futurism in local government. What are we going to look like as a consortium of municipalities and municipal managers in 50, 100 plus years from now? And I think if we really ask ourselves that question, that's when we have to face a lot of these hard truths that we've been talking about here on the dais. And something that APMM can do is now set the table for how we have those conversations. Be they regionalization or consolidation of governments, establishing more protective arrangements for managers, how we structure our contracts. How does APMM become a resource for our members when they're in distress or when they're in transition? And how do we advocate for them within the confines of our limitations ethically and principally and as a profession? But how do we take a more aggressive posture on protecting our own? So that sends a message not only to the men and women that are in this room, many of whom I've learned a great deal from in the last 14 years that I've been involved in local government, but also the next generation of municipal managers.
Yeah, just to add to that, APMM is an incredible organization, and membership is absolutely incredible. There's so much exchange of ideas. I hear from and talk to the membership, even being in Virginia, between these conferences. It's not like we only see each other and talk to each other a few times a year. The closeness here is really admirable. I think APMM should ask itself the question of, are we going to advocate for ourselves and our profession in a meaningful way? If the answer is yes, what does that look like, and how are we going to prioritize what we want to work on? We're, of course, shooting a bunch of ideas out here. I think we can answer that question, the how and the what, and that'll inform the next steps.
Yeah, I think I've changed my mind on the role of APM. And I think several years ago, I don't remember what the issue was, and it was executive board, and we were having that discussion about what should APM do, and I was like, they should remain apolitical, they don't get involved, and they shouldn't take a position. I still believe that in principle, but someone is going to have to go to bat for us if we want any changes. I don't know who that is other than APMM. So maybe if we just own it and are very open about it, that they're a lobbying group, or maybe we hire a separate lobbying group or something. Right now, there's no one watching out for managers. And again, that's unlike just about any other position in local government. I think if we want that to change, we're going to have to do that ourselves. No one's going to do it for us.
We got it, Nancy. Can we take a moment to recognize how cataclysmic a shift that is for my estimable colleague from...
But only in Pennsylvania. We'll call it the Pennsylvania exception.
I mean, I said elimination of unions, and then he said establishing unions.
You got to create...
I think on how to do that in an appropriate way. It's not a simple professional manager, which is what we are. That means something, right? When you go into a job interview and you say, I'm a professional manager, that actually has meaning. We wouldn't want to do anything to compromise that. So I think that would be a delicate needle to thread, but I think it could be done probably. Figuring out how, I think, are some of the next conversations that should happen.
Sounds good.
I know there are questions in this audience.
So yeah, we're going to open it up to the audience. If you have a question, feel free to stand up and pose it. Brad.
Hey Matt, what are your thoughts on public sector unions?
Just wind me up. There's a little knob on the back that just wind me up.
You had made a comment meeting earlier about the difficulty with regard to managers elsewhere looking to import themselves to Pennsylvania. What I've found is actually, in my assessment, that it's exceptionally difficult for Pennsylvania managers who's there. Talking now with a panel of esteemed colleagues that have done such. Do you have any tidbits of advice for managers who may be looking to export ourselves to other states? Any advice maybe in the interview process on how maybe to get over the hurdles of that, particularly in an elected body that is saying, hey, look, Pennsylvania manager, you manage a police force and a public works department. We have libraries. Any advice on that?
We're conditioned to be very timid managers because we know there's only certain things we can do. Remember, 82% or some big number of the budget, and you can't really mess with the police over here. You can't mess with the Teamsters or whatever the group is. So we're conditioned to be very timid, to get along very well in Pennsylvania, understand where you go and where you don't go, because there are sacred cows. And so maybe if you go to another state, you become this very timid manager. I found it very liberating when I was in Maryland and now in Virginia, because you have a lot more latitude to do things. People will say, I don't have to go to the elected body every time to do anything. I can actually do things based on the parameters they've already set. So I didn't see it as a problem, but if someone starts in Pennsylvania and is conditioned in Pennsylvania, and they go out of state, maybe one of the downsides is they'll be very timid and inactive. They won't take strong, bold action, which I think is really permissible, at least in Maryland and Virginia, in my experience.
Yeah, I think the reality is if you can manage here in Pennsylvania, you can manage anywhere. This is a state where the manager is a jack or Jane of all trades and a master of none. You get so much exposure to the direct work you do as local government officials that when you go to a community out of state where that might be delegated or you have a staff that can handle that, you can speak with exactitudes about how you approached a situation. You were on the front lines. You were the one collecting that data. You were the one formulating those policy recommendations. The foundation of good professional ethical management crosses state boundaries. I think, Brad, you're absolutely right. There's definitely positions that I interviewed for in my pursuits that were outside of the Commonwealth of my responsibilities as a Pennsylvania municipal manager compared to other candidates. But if you can articulate, you can really put into words how you would scale your skill and expertise to accommodate that new community, you're going to be far more advantaged because you were the one actually doing the work as opposed to I set that down to my finance department or my planning department. So again, as Matt said, don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. As managers, we're generally timid in that regard, but make sure that's your opportunity to sell it and talk about your achievements in your communities. Fred.
All the things you said, main topics were getting rid of the union consolidation of local government based by the employment agreement thing, though, I think there's a better chance of some movement there. And let me explain why. Unfortunately, in fact, I think the legislation should have named that to me. In 2007, when Carlisle told me that after 18 years, we had enough of you. I told my wife, I knew this was coming. Next day, I went to talk to council about the separation. They said, your employment agreement is not valid. I went, what? I said, who told you that? And they said, we got a legal opinion. I said, from who? Now, for those who've been around for a while, Rob Durant was, in my opinion, the best labor attorney ever worked with. In my view, in Colorado. But Bob Durant did not work for us as a man. There was a lower court case in Western PA that said employment each were not being more proactive back at that time. So we knew it was out there. I was sort of the test case. Fortunately for me, through some negotiations, I got a severance. But the point was, and Matt said this earlier, we have no representatives. Now there is an attorney that APM had available, but I didn't know this person. I reached out to him. And the long story short is, I think there's a better chance from the legislative standpoint that we found together to look at that employment agreement law. Other states don't have this issue. You're right. You have an employment agreement. It continues until they can fire us at any time they want, but it doesn't have to be re-upped every 2 years.
I think you're absolutely right, Fred. It is something that we should be talking about at the state level. And maybe it is too late. It was adopted in 1968. But there's this time bomb coming with the fire department, and there's no one saying anything about it that I'm aware of. No one. And so I don't know if it would be helpful to at least be making the case year in and year out about Act 111. You're not going to get rid of it, but reform it. But then even what you're saying about the legislation, who's going to sponsor that? I agree with you. I don't know who would sponsor it, but...
Well, the association has to take the effort to lobby this.
Yeah.
Yes, I used to work in New York State, so I appreciate. And one of the things I can say about New York State, it's different than Pennsylvania, but in many ways it's similar. Right? My point is, all the things that you guys said, which were deficits in Pennsylvania, are not there because the people who could change those things have been incompetent. They're there on purpose. So the reason we don't have automatic reassessment coming from the county with the oldest assessment in the state, 1961, is because they don't want these to raise taxes. That's the same reason they have caps expressed in millage rate in the township code. They don't want to give the authority to the local government to control their financial investment. The reason we have municipal unions, they know exactly what Act 111 does to our budgets. They're not blind to that. I participated on behalf of APMM in a number of public hearings in Harrisburg about reform to Act 111. Very depressing. And to hear the comments of state legislators about their opinions of municipal government in Harrisburg, their opinions about managers. There's a reason when the law was clarified to allow us to have an affirmative right to employment agreement expressed as a 2-year cap on that. That was discussed, and that was done on purpose. And all of these things exist to hold back our profession, us, and our municipalities. While I agree it would be terrific if APMM had a vehicle to move those issues forward, almost going to be trying to move a brick wall. And I'm not sure how in a state which has such an opinion, especially on the state government level, a local government, and even elected officials of local government, that we're ever going to have true reform in Pennsylvania. The reason there are problems in Pennsylvania was because annexation was ruled unconstitutional in the late 1960s. In other states, Maryland is a great example, annexation is an important part of local government because we should not have this many municipalities. And they should use annexation to avoid it, but that, of course, is out of the mark. I'm not really sure at this point that an organization like APMM, and I don't think that our friends at PSATS, PSAB, and PML are really going to be able to move this immovable object, which is Pennsylvania state government. I just want to frame it in terms of the financial crisis. A lot of people are aware of the report that the Pennsylvania Economy League did about a year and a half ago, that said it's not 1965 anymore. That's the title of the report.
Very good report.
Excellent report. And the whole point of that is because all of the things we mentioned, we're not going to get constituents of support to change. But the financial ledge that we're all about to fall off of, everyone, I don't care how affluent your community is, whether it be because of paid fire or inability to raise or diversify your revenue sources, we're all getting there. Different speeds, but the local government has a very serious fiscal problem in the state because of all of these other problems. And so as we frame it in terms of money, that's something the General Assembly can understand. I would love to fix employment improvements in Pennsylvania. I would much rather fix the ability to diversify and have healthy revenues in our communities.
So
which I said, we wouldn't worry about the employment.
I think what Jeff is saying is you're all too good at your jobs. You need to start taking it down a peg, train back your finances, little cuts here and there, and then allow that crisis to bubble up to the surface so that we can get a beat on it and get that Titanic turned around. I think that's right. I think I got the gist of that.
Jeff, I'll just follow up. I mean, you see a role the association can play in that sort of conversation as having access to information and being able to convey it to them.
I think the fact that an entity like the Economy League put their name on the report is much more beneficial than if it was APMM. Because, as I said, we're not held to the same level of esteem as an entity like that. Think tank type groups, whether that be the universities in Pennsylvania or any other nonpartisan new government system, that can identify the fiscal cliff that's approaching for local government and how it's going to be catastrophic for the entire state, we might be able to put together, behind the scenes, a package of reforms that will help some of these issues. That's the only thing that's going to scare me.
I wish I agreed with you. I don't think the money is going to make a difference. Too many entrenched constituencies.
Until we're all broke, until we can't do it. Yes.
All right, so we have talked about some significant systemic challenges here in Pennsylvania with the profession. You guys left to protect yourself for personal reasons, and that may be part of it, but we're going to do a very successful volunteer. I'm wondering if we could end on a positive note. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you protected yourself while you were here in dealing with these challenges, where you are now when you have systemic issues in your profession. How do you protect that?
I loved managing in Pennsylvania, and I was not necessarily on a mission to protect myself through leaving the Commonwealth. I think all of us would agree that the members of our communities are entitled to governments that function well, that operate efficiently and effectively, that do incredible things. And I agree with Matt that it's really hard to do big things in the Commonwealth, but a bunch of little things do lead to big things. And all of you are doing that in your communities. I know that's true. I know all three of us have done that in previous communities served. And people who live in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania are entitled to that. And I think it takes a lot of creativity, a lot of challenge, a lot of passion, which exists within this association to go back to your government and do that. And I think that's incredible. So we need people like you working in Pennsylvania under all of the difficult circumstances that we have, delivering good government. And I think it's an honor to do that, and I'm glad that it's happening here.
I know we sounded very negative, but I'd like to say it's more realism. If I were suggesting to a Pennsylvania manager how to protect the spark in Pennsylvania, it's have a realistic expectation of what a manager does in Pennsylvania. And so if you're reading your ICMA material, there's always got to be an asterisk next to that saying that's not necessarily dealing with Pennsylvania. It's understanding what your limitations are and learning to be happy with that. Not thinking that a manager should be doing this. I read it in PM Magazine. It's because then you'll just get very frustrated. You'll run up against a lot of these groups. I also love PA. And there's no state in the country that has more interesting and vibrant small communities than Pennsylvania. It really is a magical part about it. But being a manager here, understand what the limitations are and find satisfaction in those limitations.
And for me, I think it was, and this is going to sound kind of corny, but it is what it is. I typically would lean into the constituent services kinds of things. A structure that we exist within Pennsylvania allows us to have a lot more direct face time with our residents, the people that need our help the most. We get to be out there on the street talking with the residents about the challenges they face, about a public improvement they want to see, or a park they may want to see built, or a traffic issue that they might have. In Pennsylvania, we are in a position where we can really directly have a positive impact on that. Something that my position now I get less and less of, not that it's non-existent, but certainly not to the same degree. When I think about protecting my spark, it was just getting a lot of intrinsic value and fulfillment out of the service delivery that we get to provide every day.
So again, we're up against lunch now. We're going to conclude the session. I want to thank the House for sharing this perspective.